so we have here, I took the moment to edit this and smooth out this line so you won't get confused with all these double lines going on here. So I smoothed that out some, and also I took this and I made a mirror image of it and I flipped it. And I drew this line here sort of as our center front line. And I have that. So pretend we have a piece of paper that's this total width, okay? And you fold the piece of paper on this middle line. But then what you do, you're going to trace out your facing. And then you'll open it up. And the only part you're going to keep is this area here. You don't need any of this. All of this extra over here, you don't need that. So all you'll have is this pattern with this extra piece connected to it. So when you fold it back, then you have a neck facing and you have your placket face. So that's just one smaller example. Now let's talk about we did all of that. And then also let's say you have a cutout here. And that's going to need a facing also. So for instance, somebody, some of you watching this might like to do cutouts in the girl's side. Okay, so obviously this needs to be faced also. So let's see, let me go and delete this other piece. Delete this piece. Okay. So for instance, I would say if you're going to have a cutout piece here and you're also going to have an armhole, I'm pretty sure you could do an all-in-one shape, but just because of the difficulty of it, I would suggest doing your armhole facing. And see, that's going to run into that. So let's move this down some. And hopefully that works for your design to move it down some. Here, shapes that. Okay, so you have your facing. And then I would make a completely separate facing for this. Okay. Now something else that you could do is to just make a binding. And basically what a binding would be is whatever seam allowance you want to sew around this edge, you're not going to do a facing. You're just going to be making or taking a strip of fabric, and for this it'll be cut on the bias. So a strip of bias cut fabric, and you'll just fold it in on itself twice. So let me draw you a shape to help you understand that. So you'll have a long strip like this, and you'll cut it, or not cut it, I'm sorry, fold it into sections. Let's color that black. Copy, paste. Okay. So fold it there. And fold it there. And each of these spaces will be even. But basically, and I'll show you again later on, you'll be folding this onto the outside of this edge and then top stitching it down. And that'll be an easy way to get around doing a facing. I personally think a facing will look better, but depending on the situation, a binding might work better for you, okay? Talk about facings and linings and high-end retailers. Something that I have noticed is that in high-end retailers, and I found this out when me and one of my fellow designers, we went out to some of the high-end stores and we kind of looked around at like Neiman's and Carolina Herrera and Burberry and a couple of other stores. And we were looking and we kind of looked inside of some of the garments. And we noticed, like in school, they teach you facings on all of your edges. Any edge that doesn't have like a collar or something else on it, whatever, you need a facing. So for instance, if this was the bodice of the garment, you're going to need a facing on both of these edges. Well, we actually saw a dress that was similar to this cut. It was sleeveless and it didn't have a collar, similar to this bodice. Okay, what they did was they just did a neck facing, and then the rest of this was lining. And it sewed right onto the sleeve of the garment, or the armhole of the garment, as lining. And I was like, okay, that's kind of odd, because even for wearability issues, the sweat is going to get into the lining. It's going to get right onto the lining here. And I didn't see any type of a underarm pad or anything that would catch the sweat or anything. It was just a facing and lining. So, and whatever dart they had here, whatever. But I thought that was so odd. So, that goes to show you that even in some of the high-end retailers, they kind of break the rules. Also, something else that I noticed, let's say that this has a sleeve on it. Shapes, we'll make an imaginary sleeve. Boop, and make another sleeve. Okay, so let's pretend this is a suit jacket, okay? We were in a high-end retailer one time, and we noticed, we looked in the suit jacket to see, how it was made on the inside and what we would find. Well, we noticed that the suit jacket, I think the neck may have been just like this also, but it had your, I think all-in-one facing here, excuse me, and then it had lining attached here, but the lining stopped right at the side seam. There was no lining on the back, and and there was no lining in the sleeves either. So it was just like a faux lining that was done only on the front of the jacket. So if you open the jacket, or if the jacket kind of flew open, maybe if the wind is blowing, or if you have it unbuttoned, when it opened, it had a nice pretty blue lining on the inside. But if you took the jacket off, there was no lining at all on the back. And so I thought that was kind of odd. The only thing I can think of, maybe they wanted to keep the cost of the actual jacket down so that the profit margin might be higher. And I mean, I don't know what the reason was for that, but to me, I would think you would fully line the jacket if you're going to be paying high dollar, for that jacket. But anyway, I don't know. Okay. Last things really quickly, interfacing. In any of your facings, you will be doing interfacing also, which is the sticky stuff. I did a video series a couple of weeks ago on interfacings. So it needs to be interfaced so it can be more stable. I read somewhere that you can either interface the facing or right onto the garment, the area that's being covered by the facing. I always prefer to just do it directly on the facing. That way the garment itself doesn't take on any of the properties of the fusible. And then also, as you get a little better, I know I started to prefer non-fusibles for certain things, and just to sew your interfacing right onto the facing. That way you get the body and the stability, but you don't necessarily mess up the characteristics of the fabric by fusing it. So, and then also last thing, edge. Okay, okay. So now let's talk about the finishing of your facing. Now you can serge this edge and just leave it free hanging. That's very popular. I know I've done it a couple times depending on what the garment was. And the appearance that I wanted the inside of the garment to have, I've serged the edge. A lot of times I prefer to serge it and then fold it under and then just top stitch it as if I'm making a small rolled hem. What else? And that's the hemming, and that's the serging. Okay. I prefer if you ever fold it under and top stitch it, at least zigzag it at the very least, at the very most serge it. But I wouldn't prefer that you did did the hemming and not the serging. That's really not that good. Unless you're going to fold it twice. And if you roll it under twice, then you won't be able to see the edge, and you can just top stitch right through there. You can attach it to a lining. Like I was saying, the easiest thing about linings aren't that hard. Uh-oh, undo that. Basically, if you think about it, okay, this was the original bodice, and then if you double this pattern and make another bodice, then you can trace off where the facing is going to be, and what's left over is what the lining is. Okay, so very easy, and then of course add your seam allowance so you can sew it together. And so that's how this edge can be finished also, by attaching it to a line. And then this is something that you need to kind of do regardless. Understitching and edge stitching. That is basically, if it'll let me do it, shapes, lines. I wonder if I can change to a dotted line. I don't know, we'll just pretend this is a dotted line. So you need to sew incredibly close, I would say even up to about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And that is going to be on the inside of the garment. So let's say, okay, you have a seam, and we'll draw a seam. This is your seam. For instance, we're looking at the fabric. Okay, this side is the outside of the garment. This side is the facing. Okay, so on the facing side, you're going to push the seam allowance under over to the facing side, and then you're going to come and edge stitch right really close to the crack. Now, I've heard this also being referred to as stitch in the ditch, but if I'm correct, what stitch in the ditch is when you actually go in and you need to connect two things, but you don't want the stitching to be visible. So say, let me delete this, right here, let's say you don't have a lining, and you don't want your facing to be floating away from the shoulder seam. So what you do, you join the two pieces right at the shoulder seam by creating a stitch right into the dip in the seam. So if this is your seam right here, your shoulder seam, and let's say this underneath the fabric is where the undo. Okay, let's just leave it like that. Let's say this is where your facing ends, but we're looking at it from the top, from the self piece of fabric, from the outside of the garment. You have a pin where the facing ends. You're going to actually join the seams underneath and stitch right in the ditch. And either you can stitch the whole thing. I prefer to just stitch right here at the end. That way it's a small stitch and you have less of a chance it being seen. Okay. So really that's about it for facings. I'll be doing some more tutorials on that this week. I will catch you later. Bye bye.